There has, throughout the centuries, been many men and women who paid the ultimate price for the fact that they were terrible rulers. In France, for example, Queen Marie Antoinette went to the guillotine months after her husband had also encountered the same fate, with the slanted blade of the execution device taking their heads off. There was also two of King Henry VIII's wives who were condemned to death, and they were executed inside the Tower of London, with Anne Boleyn's execution being significantly more dignified than that of Catherine Howard's. Even the method of execution was more barbaric for the young fifth wife's date with death, but often the heads of these royals or rulers were subjected to a strange fate in the years and centuries following their deaths, and in this video we look at the heads of the executed royals and rulers. And to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 16th of October 1793, inside of Paris, Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, was executed on the guillotine. Months before, her husband, King Louis XVI, had also met the same fate, and he had been executed on the same device of death. But to many across France, Marie Antoinette was a figure of loathing, and she was a woman who would, whilst people were suffering, rub their poverty in their faces by living a very indulgent lifestyle. But the death of Marie Antoinette was a shocking one. But what happened to her head following the execution? Inside of the concierge, Marie Antoinette's fall from grace was huge. She was held inside of a prison, and the final 11 weeks of her life were spent inside of this cell. She was a woman who was Austrian and an Austrian princess, but in the years before her death she embraced great frivolity of the French royal court. She would become queen 4 years after coming to France. She was 18 and was frustrated by the fact her husband had opposite tastes. But Marie would at court spend her time gambling, partying and buying lavish gifts and items, and she became known as Madame Deficit. But she did have a good heart, and she would adopt some poor children. But despite having a soft heart, she was considered a scapegoat for the problems across the nation. Millions of people were suffering, and the diamond necklace affair made things worse. A countess tricked a cardinal into buying a hugely expensive necklace on the Queen's behalf, and many believed Marie tried to get her hands on the necklace without paying for it, and this ruined her reputation. But the French Revolution would come, and the French rose up storming the Bastille and taking up arms, and they would riot inside of many major cities over the price of bread, and they would march to the gates of Versailles. The royal couple wouldn't be officially arrested until June of 1791, when they tried to flee to Austria-controlled Netherlands. The royal family were held in the Temple, and France declared a republic. This was an end to the monarchy, which had ruled for almost 1,000 years in the country. But in the January of 1793, King Louis XVI was sentenced to death for treason against the state and the French people. He was allowed to spend some time with his family before he was executed in front of a huge crowd in Paris. But Marie Antoinette, following her husband's death, was left in prison, and she would be transferred to the concierge months before her death, which became known as the antechamber to the guillotine. And she would be held for 2 months before she was placed on trial. She was 37 years old, and her hair was white and her skin was pale. She was subjected to a 36-hour trial with 18-hour days, but huge accusations, including incest, were levelled against the Queen, and Marie would deny these. However, these accusations shocked the courtroom. She was graceful in court, but it did not save her from the executioner's block. In the hours of the 16th of October 1793, she was found guilty of high treason, depletion of the national treasury, and conspiracy against the security of the state. Shortly before her execution at the Place de la Révolution, most of the Queen's white hair was cut off. At 12:15 p.m, she walked onto the scaffold to greet Charles Henry Sampson, her executioner, who had also took the life and head of her husband, the king, months before. He was in a black mask, and he probably never believed that he would have executed the Queen of France, who was his former employer. Marie was dressed in white, and she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot, and she whispered to him, "Pardon me, sir, I did not mean to." And this was her final word. Quickly Sansom strapped her to the wooden board and slid Marie under the blade before he released it. Her head was taken off in one quick blow. Sansom then held up her head and declared, "Viva la République!" But, following her execution, Marie Antoinette's remains were taken around half a mile north, and they were taken to the graveyard behind the Church of Madeleine. However, at the time, the grave diggers, who had been burying many victims of the guillotine, were taking a lunch break, and whilst the Queen's remains were about to be interred, this allowed Madame Tussaud to then sneak in and take a plaster death mask and cast of her head. Following this, her body was then thrown into an unmarked grave, and this particular cemetery would be filled the following year by enemies of the Revolution. Marie Antoinette then had her head, it's believed, also thrown inside of this unmarked grave. But we know that Marie's body was exhumed on the 18th of January 1815, and then her remains were given a Christian burial of the royal remains in the necrophilis of the French kings at the Basilia of St. Denis. But from her death mask, Marie Antoinette would be brought back to life by Madame Tussaud, who utilised the plaster cast to make a model of her head, and it would show the French queen with short hair and with her eyes closed and her lips also pursed together with a mask on her face. This is the closest we have of the Queen of France's head and what it looked like following execution. Marie Antoinette, to many people, was a symbol of what was wrong with the old regime and with the monarch of France. It was a royal family that placed further financial problems onto the nation, and Marie was used as a scapegoat for this. She was a woman who had a taste for the finer things in life, and she spent a huge amount of money on renovating royal palaces with the best furniture from across Europe. But she would brutally lose her head on the guillotine, like thousands of other people and her husband would during the French Revolution. Those who witnessed her execution would not forget the moment they saw the French queen lose her head. Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII, made her way to the executioner's scaffold inside of the Tower of London. She had been found guilty of treason and adultery, as Thomas Cromwell had spun a web of lies that saw her condemned to death. The men accused of sleeping with Anne Boleyn were executed on Tower Hill, but Anne, being a queen, was allowed a private execution inside the Tower's walls. She was not the most liked queen that England had ever had, but she stole the king's eye away from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. This made many women think that she was a homewrecker. Henry VIII, it's believed, had impregnated Anne when the pair married, and there is still a huge amount that we do not know about Anne. After her death, the king sought to erase her from history, and the royal paintings were whitewashed and thrown away, and her symbols were erased from the royal palaces. Following her death, there were a number of questions about Anne, and some rumours came to the forefront which were rather disparaging about her. But one which was very interesting was the question as to what happened to Anne Boleyn's heart following her death. The Tudors had a tradition, or a ritual in a sense, in which very important people had their vital organs, heart, and also entrails removed after death during the embalming process. But what is the story of the missing heart of Anne Boleyn? On the 19th of May 1536, the second wife of Henry VIII was being imprisoned inside of her rooms at the Tower of London, which following her trial had turned into her prison. The place she once awaited her coronation was where she would lose her head. But the reality behind the execution of Anne was that she needed to be got rid of, as the king was lusting after and already courting Jane Seymour, one of her ladies-in-waiting. Jane would become the third wife of the king, and she did eventually give him the son that Anne could not provide him. Cromwell came up with a number of charges, and with this he asked a number of women to attend upon the Queen to provide Cromwell with information to then provide the judges with. Anne was sentenced to death in the trial that took place at the Tower of London, and an executioner was then summoned from France to perform her execution. The Sword of Calais was the anonymous executioner who used a sword to take Anne's head from her body. It was considered more reliable as a method of execution, as opposed to using the commoner's axe. The sword was considered the cleaner method of execution, and Henry VIII, despite the fact he now despised his wife, wanted her to have a death which would not go wrong. Anne was told on the morning of her execution that she was to die that day, and then she was taken from her lodgings on the short walk to the executioner's scaffold. She was dressed in a red petticoat, and with her were 2 female ladies-in-waiting that had remained with her in her final days at the Tower. She walked from the Queen's house, or the Cold Harbour Tower, around the White Tower, in front of a crowd of around 200 witnesses. Witnesses saw that she was not wailing and screaming, but instead was solemn, and it's believed had come to terms with her death whilst held inside of the fortress that is the Tower. She was helped up the stairs of the scaffold, and then she addressed the crowd and made a long speech to the king's advisers who were there. She stated that, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. And to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I condemn my soul." One of those who was there to witness the execution was Thomas Cromwell, the very man who had been the architect of her downfall and execution. But also there was the king's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, who had been sent to the Tower to see the death of Henry's second wife. On the scaffold she made her final preparations, and Anne removed her headdress and tucked her hair under a coif, and then said goodbye to her ladies. She said a few final prayers and gave to the executioner a bag of gold coins to make sure that the execution was performed swiftly. The swordsman got himself ready, and he had hidden his sword from view. Anne was knelt down with a blindfold around her eyes, and the executioner then raised his sword to the crowd, and a huge executioner's sword, and the crowd gasped. He then removed his shoes and signalled to the executioner's assistant to make a noise, and then with this Anne looked towards the assistant. The executioner then quickly and sharply swung his sword, and Anne's head was taken off in one blow. As was customary for traitors, usually the head would be showed to the crowd, but this did not happen. The executioner grabbed her gown and left the scaffold whilst her ladies were picking up her remains, and then placed them into an oak chest which had held bow staves. Across England, Anne Boleyn was mourned by a few, but others considered she was a witch who had stolen the heart of the king. However, the fact that a Queen of England was executed by her husband inside the Tower in such a brutal manner did not sit well with many, and even across Europe people heard of Henry VIII's evil and notorious reputation. After her death, the king ordered a complete erasing of Anne from history, and all portraits of her were destroyed and were whitewashed, and her insignias were removed even from the ceiling of Hampton Court Palace. But then a rumour emerged about Anne Boleyn's heart, and what happened to this after her execution. During the Tudor period, it was common for high-profile people, such as kings and queens, to have their hearts removed and then buried in different places to their bodies. This was even common during the Victorian period, as writer Thomas Hardy had his heart buried in a different location to his body. Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour, after her death at Hampton Court, had her heart removed, and this was then buried separately under the high altar of the Chapel Royal at the palace, whilst her remains were buried in a vault in St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. But after her execution, there were stories about Anne Boleyn's heart being removed following its burial inside the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula. Some people believed that her remains were taken elsewhere and were buried away from the site of her execution. Anne and the Boleyns had a strong link to Suffolk and Norfolk in England, and many thought that her body would be taken there once released to her family, and that they would be buried somewhere close to the Boleyns' family seat of power, or somewhere significant to her. But the question as to what happened to Anne Boleyn's heart was very interesting. It's believed by some that Anne Boleyn's heart was removed from her body after her execution, and that this was then taken from the Tower of London and was then buried inside St Mary's Church in Owarton in Suffolk. It was believed that Anne had told her ladies that her heart should be buried in this exact place after her death, as her heart remained close to the place she loved spending time. This rumour emerged during the Tudor period, and her uncle, Sir Philip Colthorpe, who married Anne's aunt, had actually owned the Tudor mansion that stood near to the church, so Anne as a young girl had spent a lot of time there, and she loved playing and relaxing in the land owned by her uncle. It was said that she was the happiest when she was at this Tudor house, and that this is why her heart was to stay there. However, after her execution, lots of people believed that her heart was taken and was then interred in this church in Suffolk. It would have had to have been taken from the Tower of London, as it's unlikely the king would have never given permission for this. There could also be an element of truth in this, as in the 19th century, the church had some work completed on renovations. It was then said that underneath the organ, a small heart-shaped lead casket was found, and inside of this box was a lot of dust. It was believed that this in fact could have been the decaying matter of Anne Boleyn's heart. Some historians doubt the authenticity of this, as Henry VIII took great steps to make sure that Anne Boleyn was wiped from history, but many of the locals believe that Anne Boleyn's heart was removed. During the Victorian times, Anne Boleyn's remains were discovered, and it was found that these were the Queen's remains, as the body had suffered a beheading. But interestingly, there was no record of her heart being found, as this would have disintegrated a long time ago, meaning that it was possible that the heart could have been moved. It could have been taken by people sympathetic to Anne, and there were a number who backed her. But today, inside the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula, the remains of Anne Boleyn are laid to rest, and it is a poignant burial next to the place where the second wife of Henry VIII lost her head. On the 30th of January, 1649, at the age of 48, King Charles I was led through the banqueting hall in London to an executioner's scaffold that had been created for him. He was the king who had plunged England into the bloodiest civil war that the country had ever seen, where Parliament fought against the king's forces for supremacy. Eventually, against the odds, Parliament would defeat Charles, and following his arrest and imprisonment, there was a debate as to what to do with the monarch. Some advocated for him to be sent into exile abroad in Europe, but others feared he would come back to defeat Parliament with a European army backed by other powerful rulers. But the talk then came to executing the king, and bringing his life to an end once and for all. For many across the country, Charles was a useless ruler who believed he had been sent by God to rule, and with this many of his subjects who would oppose his policies and the fact he was raising taxes without the consent of Parliament. But many wanted the tyrant to lose his head, and following his trial, this is exactly what happened. But the story of the king's head is one which is rather shocking and brutal. Charles I, as mentioned, was seen as a tyrannical absolute monarch, and many of his policies and choices rubbed people up the wrong way. Even the fact he was married to a Catholic created controversy across the country, and his failings led to the Civil War breaking out. But in 1645, he would suffer a heavy defeat at the hands of the Parliamentarian New Model Army, and Charles would then flee north from Oxford, heading towards Scotland. But he was captured and surrendered to a Scottish army following negotiations between England and Scotland's parliaments. But this then began a number of years of imprisonment for Charles, as he would be housed in a number of different places. He had been held before inside of Hampton Court Palace, but he managed to escape and was eventually transferred to Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight. He would try to negotiate with Parliament, but nothing came to fruition, and following this, Charles was then brought to trial. He was accused of treason against England and its people, and of using his power to pursue his own interests rather than what was good for the country. He claimed that his trial was illegal, and said that no earthly power can justly call me, who am your king, in question as a delinquent. This day's proceeding cannot be warranted by God's laws, for, on the contrary, the authority of obedience unto kings is clearly warranted, and strictly commanded in both the Old and New Testament. For the law of this land, I am no less confident than no learned lawyer will affirm that an impeachment can lie against the king, they all going in his name, and one of their maxims is that the king can do no wrong. The higher house is totally excluded, and for the House of Commons it is too well known that the major part of them are detained or deterred from sitting. The arms I took up were only to defend this fundamental laws of this kingdom against those who have supposed my power hath totally changed the ancient government. He was a man who clearly believed the only being he was answerable to was God, who had appointed him to rule, and he believed, as the sovereign ruler of the nation, that he could not be tried by his people. He said, "The King of England was not a person, but an office whose every occupant was entrusted with a limited power to govern by, and according to the laws of the land, and not otherwise." In the dock he was obstinate, and was a man who was very stubborn. For this he was then removed from court on the third day, and 30 witnesses against him were heard. On the 26th of January 1649 he was sentenced to death. He was brought back into the trial, and it was heard. For all which treasons and crimes this court doth adjudge that he, the said Charles Stuart, as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body. And 59 commissioners and high-ranking people, including his nemesis, Oliver Cromwell, signed the king's death warrant. It was a shocking thing, a king being executed by his own people, and was in a sense a revolution across England. The execution of the king was all set to be carried out on the 30th of January 1649. The king was moved from the Palace of Whitehall to St James's Palace, as workmen were beginning to create the scaffold for his execution, which was set up outside of the banqueting house, near to Whitehall Palace. Charles spent his final few days praying, and he would the day before burn his personal papers, letters, and ciphered letters. He had not seen his children for over a year, but he was allowed to speak to his 2 youngest children, Elizabeth and Henry, one last time. He told Elizabeth to remain a true Protestant, and told Henry not to accept ever being made king by Parliament, as was suspected. Charles then went to bed at 2 a.m. on his final night, and he was restless in the knowledge that the next day would be his last. On the morning of his execution, he awoke and began dressing at around 5 a.m, and he wore all black and his blue garter sash, and then instructed the gentleman of the bedchamber with what to do with his belongings, and he asked for an extra shirt, as it was a cold day, and he did not want his shivers on the scaffold to be interpreted as fear. He then was told to ready for his execution, and he drank a glass of wine and ate some bread before he was taken to the scaffold. A huge crowd had gathered outside of the banqueting house to see Charles's execution, and the scaffold was draped in black. There was even restraints ready to hold the king down if needed, and the executioner's block was very low. Charles had to lie on the block rather than kneel. The executioners were hidden behind masks and wigs, and then at 2 p.m. Charles was called onto the scaffold in what has been described as the saddest sight England ever saw. He made a short speech in front of the crowd and declared that he was innocent of any crimes and that he would die a king, and in heaven he would remain one. He said he was a martyr of the people who was being killed for the rights of men. He said, "As for the people, truly I desire their liberty and freedom as much as any whosoever. But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having of government by those laws by which their lives and their goods may be most their own. It is not for them to have a share in government. That is nothing, sirs, appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things, and therefore until that be done, I mean until the people be put back into that liberty which I speak of, certainly they will never enjoy themselves." But then the time came for the final preparations. He asked for a silk nightcap so that the executioner could try and make as clean a cut on his neck as possible, to prevent anything going wrong with an axe being caught in his hair. He said he would go from a corruptible crown to an incorruptible crowd. And then he handed over his garter sash and cloak and said to his attendants, "Remember." With this the king then laid his head on the very low block, and he signalled to the executioner by stretching his arms out. With this the executioner swung his axe, and in one clean swift blow the head of King Charles I was taken off. The executioner then, without uttering a word, picked up King Charles's head and showed it to the crowd, and he did not declare the traditional, "Behold the head of a traitor." The executioner then, it's alleged, dropped the king's head into the crowd, and with this a number of guards and soldiers rushed around it, and they hacked off pieces of Charles's hair, as well as dipping their handkerchiefs in his blood. But this was not the story of his head. Following this, his head must have then been taken back up onto the scaffold and was reunited with his body. The remains of the king were gathered up, and according to one account were then placed together in a coffin which was ready for him on the scaffold. Once the head and body were in the coffin, it was carried then into a room in Whitehall Palace. After this his body was exposed for many days to the public view, that all men might know that he was not alive. With this, it means that people would visit the palace and would see Charles's headless body and his head in the coffin to prove that he was dead. One man who saw this, Sir Purbeck Temple, said, "The head of the blessed martyr's king lie in a coffin with his body, which smiled as perfectly as if it had been alive." After a number of days, the remains were then taken to St. James's Palace, whilst Parliament worked out where to bury it. Some accounts state that the body was embalmed at Whitehall before it was removed, but it's not known for certain where this was done. One account claims this took place on the large table in the Dean of Westminster's kitchen immediately after the execution, but another lord said it was embalmed after the public display. The man who was ordered to embalm the king was Thomas Trapham, Surgeon General to Parliament's army, but others have said the doctor that did this did a poor job. There are accounts also that the king's head was placed back on his body ready for burial. William Add claimed that their order to embalm had specific instructions as to sew the head back on. This was not unknown for high-profile executed people. The tradition is that inside the deanery at Windsor that the king's head was reattached to the body, where the coffin rested before it was taken into the resting place. But what was interesting was that in 1813, Sir Henry Halford, the king's physician, opened the burial vault in Windsor in St. George's Chapel and came across the remains of the executed king. When the coffin was broken into and the cerecloth unwrapped, the men found that the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachments which confined it, and it was found to be loose and was taken up and held to view. This means that the men held up the king's head as it had come apart from his body. This may have been due to the sewing thread used at the time becoming rotten, and after this the body and severed head were then placed back into the coffin. King Charles I was a monarch who was regarded by many as a tyrant, and his story today still captivates people around the world. He would go to the executioner's scaffold, a broken man, but he would stick to his beliefs and principles, and for this he would lose his head. But what happened to his head following his execution is shocking, and it's something that shows how brutal and barbaric 17th century England could be. The French Revolution was a pivotal moment in history, as the civilian population around the country rose up and sought to abolish their monarchy. No one would have anticipated the bloodshed that occurred after, as the Reign of Terror emerged across France, with around 17,000 people being led to the guillotine inside of different cities and towns. Dozens a day were being executed as figures such as Robespierre wanted to stomp out every piece of the monarchist sympathy as they could. But this was in the aftermath of the execution of the French king, Louis XVI, and he was a king who was not perfect, and he attracted a huge amount of hatred and criticism from his subjects. But Louis XVI would be led to the guillotine himself, where an executioner took his head clean off. But following his death, a mould of his head would be cast, and this was done by the infamous Madame Tussaud, and it shows a rather haunting image of the king in his final moments. King Louis XVI was the last king of France, and along with his wife Marie Antoinette, the queen, the royal couple attracted a huge degree of criticism. Whilst the French people were starving due to the rising prices of bread, the monarchy was spending lavish sums of money on furniture, parties, and they were gambling away huge amounts of the treasury. Because of the anger, revolution broke out with key events such as the storming of the Bastille, destabilising the monarchy, and eventually the king and queen and royal family were taken into custody. There have been conversations across Europe regarding saving them, but the increasing tension towards them saw the king brought to trial. He was forced to abolish the monarchy, and France became a republic. Louis was himself brought to trial, and he would be brought from the Temple prison to stand before the National Convention. He was accused of high treason and crimes against the state, and on the 15th of January 1793, 721 deputies and members of the convention voted on what to do with him. 693 declared that he was guilty. But the men then had to decide what to do with the king. 361 of them voted for execution, and Louis XVI was condemned to death by one single vote. The immediate execution of the king was then arranged, and this would be the final decision. His execution took place on the 21st of January 1793. On the day, Louis woke up early in the morning. His valet helped him dress, and he then visited an Irish priest to make his confession. He would hear his last mass and receive communion, but Louis was advised to not see his family as it would be too tough. He then confided his final wishes to the priest, that the royal seal was to go to the Dauphin, and that his wife the Queen should receive his wedding ring. Following the blessing, he went to meet the commander of the guard. In the second court, a green carriage was waiting for him, and he then sat in it along with the priest and two guards who sat opposite. The carriage then left the temple at 9 a.m, and for over an hour, the carriage, which was led by drummers, would process to the place of execution. The drummers played to drown out the sound of any support, and the route to the guillotine was lined by 80,000 soldiers of the National Guard. They were also escorted by cavalry soldiers with their sabres drawn. One supporter of the royal family had gathered a force of 300 men in the neighbourhood of Rue de Clery. However, he was then discouraged as the men changed their support. At 10 o'clock, the carriage carrying the king emerged at the Place de la Revolution and went towards an area where the scaffold had been erected, where the guillotine was set upon. The guillotine, as a device, was created to execute people as quickly as possible, and the king would give his approval to this years before, but he would never have imagined that his royal patronage would lead him to losing his head on the device. In the square were many guards who surrounded the scaffold with guns, and a crowd carrying pikes and bayonets were also found. His confessor wrote of the journey. The path leading to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when, arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold, silenced by his look alone 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud that it must have been heard at the Pont Tournant. I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." Louis XVI then disembarked his carriage and coach, and he was then approached by the executioner, Charles Henry Sansom, who would perform the job. He would, to begin with, not allow the executioner and his assistant to bind his hands together and tie them, but he would then give over when Sansom suggested using a handkerchief rather than a rope. The executioner's men then quickly cut his hair and removed the collar of his shirt to ensure that nothing got snagged in the blade of the guillotine that would prevent a clean cut. He was then led up the scaffold. Whilst on it, he shouted to the crowd and proclaimed that he was innocent, but then a drum roll was ordered to drown out the final sentences and send him towards his death. The executioners then fastened the king to the guillotine bench, and they then positioned this beneath the device to hold it into place. Then, rather rapidly, the blade was released and the king's head was taken off. One eyewitness stated that the blade did not sever the neck, but due to a misalignment, the blade went straight through the back of his skull and into his jaw. But then Sansom grabbed the severed head from the basket, which it fell into, and showed it to the crowd as the people rushed forwards to dip their handkerchiefs in the blood of the deceased former king. The executioner would later state of the execution: "Arriving at the foot of the guillotine, Louis XVI looked for a moment at the instruments of his execution and asked Sanson why the drums had stopped beating. He came forwards to speak, but they were shouts to the executioners to get on with their work. As he was strapped down, he exclaimed, 'My people, I die innocent.' Then, turning towards his executioner, Louis XVI declared, 'Gentlemen, I am innocent of everything of which I am accused. I hope that my blood may cement the good fortune of the French.' The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. One of the assistants of Sansom showed the head of Louis XVI to the people, whereupon a huge cry of Vive la Nation, Vive la République, arose, and an artillery salute rang out, which reached the ears of the imprisoned royal family. Another witness would state, 'Here are some unknown details. The executioners numbered 4. 2 only performed the execution. The 3rd stayed at the foot of the ladder, and the 4th was on the wagon which was to convey the king's body to the Madeleine cemetery, and which was waiting a few feet from the scaffold. The executioner wore breeches, coats in the French style, as the Revolution had modified it, and 3 cornered hats with enormous tricolour cockades. They executed the king with their hats on, and it was without taking his hat off that Sansom, seizing by the hair the severed head of Louis XVI, showed it to the people, and for a few moments let the blood from it trickle upon the scaffold. But then, after the execution, at some point, Marie Tussaud, or Madame Tussaud, was then employed to make a death mask or whole body cast of the executed king, Louis XVI. She would also do the same for Marie Antoinette and other prominent French politicians, and she would have done this before his body was interred. This is interesting, as the king's remains were immediately transported to the Church of Madeleine, as he was not allowed to be buried alongside his father. He was buried in a sense as a commoner. but at some point Madame Tussaud would have had her hands on the head of the dead king. This would have been done possibly whilst he was still on the scaffold, or in the seconds after, or inside of the cart when his remains were taken to the church. With Marie Antoinette, she would have to sneak into the graveyard to do this, but the head crafted of King Louis XVI would show him in his final seconds and the countenance of the king following the blade falling. It was said of his burial, "Arriving at the cemetery, I called for silence. A detachment of gendarmes showed us the body. It was clothed in a white vest and grey silk breeches with matching stockings. We chanted vespers and the service for the dead. In pursuance of an executive order, the body lying in its open coffin was thrown onto a bed of quicklime at the bottom of the pit and covered by earth, the whole being firmly and thoroughly tamped down. Louis XVI's head was placed at his feet." But King Louis XVI's death was a momentous moment in history, as it signalled the intent of the French Revolution. His wife would also lose her head on the guillotine, but so would thousands more who supported the monarchy. One of the leading figures in the French Revolution, and also the Reign of Terror that came after, was Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was a brutal man who championed the executions of over 17,000 people who were marched into public squares in France, where they were executed on the guillotine. His idea was that using terror and fear would stop people from questioning the new order, and Robespierre wanted to stamp out all of the notions and feelings of monarchy that could be found within the French civilians. But despite the guillotine blade falling dozens of times a day across the country, Robespierre himself would fall from grace, and he was executed himself. People got tired of the fear, and Robespierre was executed on the same guillotine as King Louis XVI in Paris at the Place de la Révolution. After his death, his head was then subjected to a cast by Madame Tussaud's, and this shows the harrowing final moments of the man regarded by many as the despotic tyrant. But what is the story of the head of Robespierre? Maximilien Robespierre was born at Arras on the 6th of May 1758. As a young man he would study law, but he then took a leap into politics and local government inside of his hometown. He would join the Estates General, but across the nation many people were getting fed up with the monarchy and the king and the queen. There was a huge amount of suffering inside of France as prices rose and people began to starve, but King Louis XVI and his queen Marie Antoinette were living a very lavish lifestyle. They were having huge banquets and spending a huge amount of money from the treasury on furniture and renovating their palaces. People in France needed help, but Marie continued to spend a lot of money on jewellery, clothing, and she would also gamble lots away at her parties. Robespierre then emerged as a leading figure with the idea of revolution, and he became a figure who championed democracy and was regarded as a radical. He hated and loathed the king and queen, and he would oversee the Jacobins, a group who promoted the idea of revolution in France, and they also championed the overthrow and abdication of the French monarchy. Robespierre would call upon people in the nation to rise up and rebel against the military defeats and the fact they were starving, but Robespierre campaigned, following the king's arrest, for the monarch to be placed on trial for treason, and he would then push further for the king to be executed. He would eventually get this, but inside of Paris he was a man who was very popular. Robespierre's statement and rhetoric continued to attack the monarchy, and he would call for reform. But he was then, in the August of 1792, elected the first deputy for Paris to the National Convention. The convention would abolish the monarchy and declare France a republic. The king, as mentioned, was then placed on trial, and Robespierre supported this, and the king would then be dragged to the Place de la Révolution in January of 1793, where he lost his head on the guillotine. But there would then be a significant struggle for power within the National Convention following this, and there was tension between the Jacobins and the Girondins as to who would spearhead the new government. The groups wanted different things, and the Jacobins would then order the arrest of the Girondins, and they would use mob rule to do this. but the control of France then passed to the Committee of Public Safety, of which Robespierre was a part of, and he would then emerge as a powerful part of this committee. However, in France there was a huge threat from foreign invasion, and many, including the Austrians and the Persians, were angry with the fact the king and soon-to-be queen were attacked and were executed. The monarchs of these countries were mostly concerned that the ideas of revolution could spread to their countries, but because of this, Robespierre then began to call for strong answer, and there was a huge amount of lawlessness and disorder across the country. The committee then sought to eradicate anyone who was an enemy of the revolution or who was suspected of doing this. This is known as the Reign of Terror, and Robespierre was a powerful figure who was in charge of this. He would state this was necessary and spoke to the crowds and said, "If the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, then the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue, without which terror is baneful, terror, without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, and inflexible justice. It is thus an emendation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy, applied to the most pressing needs of the homeland." The Terror was a brutal and barbaric time, and many people who were just suspected of being dissident to the new regime were dragged to the guillotine and were executed. France was being ruled by terror, and everyone had to be careful about what they said for fear of execution. A huge number of laws were brought in, then carried a capital charge, including cutting down a tree of liberty, or speaking out for the former king and queen. There were accounts of women whose husbands would be taken to the guillotine, and when they lost their heads, the wives would cry. This was interpreted by the officials as an act of sympathy for the old regime, and because of this, seconds later, the women were beheaded on the guillotine. The streets would run red with the blood of the condemned on the guillotine, but eventually Robespierre would fly too close to the sun, and he too would be executed. As he became more powerful and more like a dictator, his popularity would fall. He would state to the National Convention that they should bring a new religion for the nation, the cult of the Supreme Being. However, Robespierre was now a symbol of hatred due to the brutality of terror, and many said he was acting like a tyrannical monarch, and they'd just got one of these on the guillotine. There were a number of French successes with the army, but Robespierre was now in danger. He was arrested, along with his friend and allies, on the 27th of July 1794, after rebels conspired against him. He was injured in the arrest and struggle, and a bullet hit him in the jaw. But the following day he would be dead. Eyewitnesses would see his brutal downfall, and one of them wrote a detailed account of his final moment. He wrote, "At 4 in the afternoon, the sinister procession moved out to the courtyard of the Palais de Justice. No crowd of such size had ever been seen in Paris. The streets were choked with people, spectators, men and women of all ages, filled every window, and men had climbed onto the rooftops. There was a universal jubilation coupled with popular fury. The long-suppressed hatred against these criminals now exploded with doubled force. Everyone applauded wildly and seemed to be sorry they could not do more." Most of the watchers fixed their gaze on the cart in which Robespierre, his brother, Caution and Henry were riding. These miserable creatures were all mutilated and covered with blood. They looked like a band of brigands the gendarmes had surprised in the forest and were unable to arrest without inflicting serious wounds upon them. It would be difficult to describe the appearance of Robespierre. His face was wrapped in a bandage of dirty, blood-stained linen. His features were horribly disfigured. A pale pallor made it even more repulsive. He kept his eyes downward and almost closed. Whether that was from the pain of his wounds or an awareness of his misdeeds, one cannot say. Just before arriving at the place of execution, Robespierre was shaken out of his lethargy by a woman who forced her way through the crowd and rushed up to the cart carrying this cannibal. She grasped the cart rail with one hand and threatened Robespierre with the other, saying, "Monster, spewed from hell, the thought of your punishment intoxicates me with joy." Robespierre opened his eyes and looked her sadly as she said, "Go now, evildoer, go down into your grave carrying the curse of the wives and mothers of France." When the cart had reached the foot of the scaffold, the executioners carried the tyrant down and laid him out prone until it was his turn for execution. While his accomplices were being beheaded, Robespierre appeared not to be taking notice. He kept his eyes shut and did not open them until he himself was carried up the scaffold. Some said that when he saw the instrument of death, he heaved a sigh of pain, but before dying he had to endure bitter suffering. After having thrown down his coat, the executioner roughly tore away the bandage and splint which the surgeons had put on his wounds. This unhinged his lower jaw from the upper jaw and caused the blood to flow in torrents. The wretched man's head was now no more than an object of horror and repulsion. When at last it was severed from his body, the executioner held it up by the hair to show the people. It presented a indescribably horrible sight. Thus perished the fiercest of the savage beasts, the most monstrous criminal that nature ever conceived. On the 2 days that followed, 83 other rebels were put to death, mainly members of the Commune or their outlawed accomplices. But at some point, Madame Tussaud would craft a death mask and a head of Robespierre. She'd done this before with Marie Antoinette, as she would while the gravediggers were having lunch sneak into the graveyard and would take a cast of her head. She would mould the head of Robespierre following his execution, and in some version of the events she moulded the head of Robespierre at the foot of the guillotine. She would do this in a sense to stay loyal to the government. There were efforts to prevent access to the corpse of Robespierre to stop relic hunters, and it was said that they tried to inter his body quickly. It was not easy to cast a death mask and a wax cast of a guillotined head. It was said, in order to create a death mask, there was a specific process. First, the deceased's hair and eyebrows were covered with clay or oil so that the plaster would not stick to it. Next, plaster was ladled over the head of the individual. Sometimes this meant propping them up into a sitting position, as seen in the picture, or carefully doing it lying down. Next, a thread was placed from the bottom of the chin to the top of the forehead in this thinner plaster. Fourth, thicker plaster was added, and the string was removed to create a mask in 2 halves for easier removal. Once hard, the mould was removed, and then placed back together before a mask could be made. The plaster cast was cleaned, and then filled with modelling clay, or new plaster, to make the mask. The head of Robespierre, which was made by Madame Tussaud, shows his face looking gaunt, and it does not show the injury to his jaw that he had before the guillotining. It was said that of casting, after the execution of Robespierre, Madame Tussaud took a cast from his mutilated head, but it was not the first time his feature had been submitted to her skilful hands, he having expressed a wish that his portrait should be introduced. But the head of Robespierre is a harrowing and brutal image of the man who brought so much terror to France, and it shows him in his final seconds following the guillotine blade being released upon him.